Kids at war. Tens of thousands of children around the world have been kidnapped from their villages and forced to become soldiers. Meet one who was lucky enough to escape. Grace heard the warnings. They came in the form of whispers. Alarmed, the villagers whispered the warnings from person to person. Soldiers are coming. Grace was just 10 years old, but already her life in South Sudan had been ripped apart by violence. A bloody civil war had been raging in the Central African country. It started in 2013 when rebel forces tried to overthrow the president. 2 years later, the rebels were still clashing with government troops. Grace's dad had long ago left home to fight. Chaos was swirling around her, but Grace kept attending school. She helped look after her 4-year-old sister, and on weekends she joined her mother on the roadside to sell vegetables. Grace's family had no electricity in their small mud and grass hut. They did not have a TV, radio, or phone, so they depended on the word of mouth for news of the war. This is how they knew that soldiers on both sides were forcing civilians, even kids, to fight. Grace had heard stories of sons and daughters being dragged away from their parents by armed troops. Soldiers are coming. Whenever the whispers came, Grace and her family would pack up and flee. They would hide in the wilderness or a different village. They had taken shelter at a farm nearby on the day the war finally caught up with them. Kidnapped. At the farm, Grace's mother helped with gardening to earn money. One afternoon, her mom dug in the dusty soil and Grace watched her sister nearby. A man approached. He asked for water and work. Neither request was unusual. Millions of South Sudanese had been left poor, hungry, and homeless because of the conflict. Grace's mom handed the man water to drink. She gave him a shovel to dig. Then she turned back to her work. But just as she looked away, the man signaled to people hiding nearby. 5 uniformed men appeared. They were waving guns and yelling wildly. They surrounded Grace, her mother, and her sister. They ordered them to sit on the ground. The family sat trembling. Then one of the men spoke. "We are going to train you," he said, "to become soldiers." Forced to fight. It may be hard to imagine your age or even younger fighting in wars. It may be hard to imagine kids your age or even younger fighting in wars. After all, in the United States, we have a volunteer military. You must be at least 17 years old to enlist. You must also meet certain health and educational requirements. But in other parts of the world, boys and girls as young as 8 are routinely recruited by armed groups. Many military groups find children easier to control than adults. That includes children orphaned by war. Child soldiers are forced to do everything. They carry equipment and cook. They spy on opponents and take part in combat. Like Grace, many of these kids are kidnapped by groups of soldiers. But some kids volunteer to fight because they have no other way to get food. Sometimes communities join local armed groups in exchange for protection. But the situation they end up in is often even deadlier. The life of a child soldier. The men who kidnapped Grace and her family were part of a rebel group fighting against the government. At the rebels' camp, Grace was separated from her mom. The troops grouped her with other girls her age. Grace recognized many of them from her village. This was a small comfort. From then on, Grace spent her days stealing supplies from villages. She fetched water. She gathered firewood. She struggled to carry the heavy loads back to camp. If she did not move quickly, she was beaten. At night, she took shelter with the other girls in a round hut that they had built themselves. Grace's mother spent mornings cooking for the rebel soldiers. In the afternoons, she was trained for war. New recruits had to march in step. They had to swing their arms in perfect time. Some were taught to shoot guns. People who refused the training faced brutal punishment. They were tied to trees and beaten with sticks by kids, including Grace. She was terrified, especially when she had to hit grown-ups. Still, she carried out the beatings. She knew that if she did not, she might be killed. A risky escape. Over the next few months, Grace had no choice but to adapt to her new life. Yet she dreamed of escaping. One day, she and her family got their chance. It was about 6 months into their imprisonment. It happened while they were fetching water one morning. They dumped their jugs by the side of the river and ran. They eventually made it back to their village, but memories proved harder to outrun. Grace could not forget all the violent things she had seen and done. Her mind replayed the beatings she had received and the ones she had given out. She also faced discrimination. Many former soldiers are bullied for having been associated with armed groups, even if it was against their will. Many are cast out of their villages, and children who are forced to help rebels often fear that government officials will find out and arrest them. A fresh start. One day, Grace's family heard that government and aid groups had opened a center nearby for former child soldiers. The center offered counseling and medical care. Grace spent 6 months at the center. She learned how to deal with the trauma, guilt, and anxiety that haunted her. While there, she shared her story with Child Soldiers International. That is a human rights organization based in the United Kingdom. It helped improve how child soldiers are reintroduced into communities. Grace returned home in June 2018. She was ready to move forward. Now 13, Grace is back in school. She studies and plays with other kids. It is almost like her times as a child soldier never happened. But the violence is far from over. Neighboring countries have been trying to create a ceasefire in South Sudan, but fighting continues. Thanks to aid groups, nearly 1,000 child soldiers have been freed over the past 2 years. But kids are still being forced into the conflict, and many parts of the country are too dangerous for aid workers to reach. That means they cannot help child soldiers in those areas. As for Grace, she tries to stay focused on the future. She dreams of becoming a doctor someday. That would be her way of helping her family and the many other people just like them finally recover.